Hi, my name is Lee Stranahan, and welcome to Lightwave Essential Surfaces. In this tape, we're going to be talking about creating realistic and great-looking surfaces for your objects, and this is one of the most important subjects that you can know in terms of Lightwave. You can get away with models that are not that complex, with models you can probably make very, very easily, and if you've got good surfaces, your final images are going to look just great. We got a lot to cover, so let's get started right away, and the first topic we want to talk about is assigning surfaces. So let's load up an object, and we're already in Lightwave, and we will just load up the NewTek logo in the tutorials drawer. And let's go to our surfaces menu here. And you notice our current surface is NTN fonts, and we have one of these double triangle buttons. This lets us open up and go through to see the different surfaces. The keyboard shortcut for moving between the surfaces is these arrow keys, the up and down arrow keys here. And you see how it's moving through the surface names listed here. And again, you could find that out also by hitting the help key, because it's context-sensitive help in Lightwave. It will show you which buttons will work currently. So it also shows you the shifted version goes through the first or the last surface. Now, the question is, where do these surface names come from? You can see we have these names, but where do they come from? Who made them? Why do we have them? And what's going on? So these surface names are created in Modeler. And they're created in a very straightforward fashion, and we'll go in and we'll see how those are created and rename surfaces. But the important thing to know about these surface names is that they are just names. They really have nothing to do with the surface that's created. So for instance, take a look here. You see we have a surface called blue bar. We also have a surface called red bar. We also have one called green bar, and there's NTN fonts. Well, let's just hit continue here, and let's go to camera, low resolution, and just hit F9. First we'll go to our camera view so we can make sure it's centered. Let's hit F9, just do a quick render. And we'll look at the program monitor and you'll see, there we go, we have this white surface, the letters, then a red, blue, and green bar. Well, let's go in and let's reassign surface names. So the first thing we want to talk about is how we actually assign these names. Okay, to do this we go into the modeler, and let's head into the modeler, and what I'm going to do is we have the ability to import and export objects within Lightwave 3.0 and Lightwave 4000. So I'm going to use the import function, and what this will do is it will take objects from our scene. The only object in our scene right now is the NewTek logo, so we'll select that, and here is the NewTek logo. Now let's go through and find out what surface names are here, and to do that we're going to select polygon. So again, we have three choices down here: point, polygon, and volume. And then we're going to hit the W key, which brings up our statistics menu. This is just a keyboard shortcut for statistics, which is also located under the display menu right here. But it's a little bit quicker if we do it this way. So W for statistics. And this shows us how many polygons there are, in other words, how many faces there are in this object. And down here, this is the important thing to us. It shows us plus or minus. This means select or deselect. Plus is select, minus is deselect. It says 0 polygons have the surface named default. Okay? So what this is telling us is that there are currently no surfaces named default in this particular object. Let's go through, because again we have these triangle buttons here, and we can select through the other ones. Let's go through blue bar. There are 12 surfaces with the surface name blue bar, 12 with green bar, 12 with red bar, and then a whopping 56 with NTN fonts. So let's do this. Let's just select the blue bar here. We'll hit plus, and this will select all 12 surfaces that have the name blue bar. So plus, and you can see right here, these polygons have been selected. They're highlighted and they have these little dotted lines coming out of them. Now what we're going to show you here, if you don't understand it, you want to get some basic familiarity with Modeler. Now a real basic familiarity with Modeler is beyond the scope of this tape. There's another tape in the series that covers Modeler, but what we're doing here is very, very important. If you don't understand how to select polygons and assign surface names to them, well then working with surfaces won't be very, very much use to you. So here's what we're going to do. We can see that we have these 12 polygons selected, these two objects. And now since there are polygons highlighted, I can deselect them just by clicking on the surfaces. And you see, these ones are now deselected. These two are still selected, so we'll click on those. And now just the middle bar in the E is chosen. Now, its current name is blue bar. Let's change the name. To change the name, we go to the polygon menu, and under transform, there's a surface button. The keyboard equivalent for this, by the way, is the Q key. Q for surface. And again, if W for statistics makes sense, so will Q for surface. So we'll hit the surface button here, and we can change the surface name. Now, if we want to, we can reassign it to any of the names that we already have chosen. If we wanted to remake this one, for instance, as red bar, we would just select red bar, click on apply, and that would take all of these polygons, and now these have the surface name red bar. Well, let's make a new surface name. To do that, we're going to use the same requester we just used. So we're going to click on the same button, surface, and now let's type in a new name. And let's wax poetic here. We'll name it Shiny Gold Metallic. And let's hit apply. And when we hit apply here, this is going to apply the surface name Shiny Gold Metallic to this middle bar. Notice there's one other button here. Let's talk about that for a second. That's rename. That would let us, for instance, if we wanted to rename blue bar, let's just clear this out, and let's name this middle bar on left. We could rename this. So now this surface is no longer blue bar, it's middle bar on left. And just to see that, let's deselect all the polygons. To deselect all polygons, you just click in a blank area here. And now I'll hit W again. And now you'll see we have nothing with default, 12 with green bar, 6 with middle bar on left, 56 with NTN fonts, 12 for red bar, and 6 with shiny gold metallic. Okay. Now what we've done here is we've given these things some new names. The one on the left is now called one on the left. The one on the right is now called shiny gold metallic. We've modified this object, so now let's export this object. In other words, let's take this object and put it back in the scene. Okay? Go to the Objects menu, click and hold down Export, and we want to replace the NewTek logo. And it asks us if that's okay to export it to replace it. Yes, it is. Now when we go back to Layout, using this button up here, looks like the same object, but if we go to the Surfaces panel, you'll see that we have these new names here. So default, NTN fonts, middle bar, and shiny gold. Now, this is called shiny gold metallic. Let's hit render, and let's see the wonder of animation here. Well, you'll see that the bar on the right doesn't look particularly shiny, gold, or metallic. In fact, it just looks boring. Well, that's because naming a surface in Modeler doesn't really mean anything. These are just names. You can give them as complex names as you want or as simple names as you want, but it doesn't have anything to do with the way the actual surface renders. What you do in Modeler is basically you assign these names, and it's a crucial step because if you're, for instance, making a TV set or something like that, you need to tell it how to make the screen a different surface than the knobs, which you also want to be a different surface in the cabinet. On the other hand, though, that just assigning the names doesn't create those surfaces for you. We create all of our surfaces within Lightwave, within the main section of Lightwave, and we do that from the Surfaces panel. Now, one thing that's important to remember here is that, and I'm going to repeat this a couple times because this is one of the things that messes people up. Once we start to change our surface attributes, if we want these new surface attributes to stay with the object, we have to resave the object in Lightwave. Let me say that again. When we start changing our attributes, if we want to save the surface attributes with the object, we need to resave the object. And we resave an object in Lightwave. Let me hit Escape to exit here. You resave an object from the Objects menu. Save Object will save whatever current object you have. And again, this will replace the old object with your new object. And the new object here, the only difference between the two objects, the old one and the new one, might be different surface names or surface attributes. So again, you'll see we'll need to do that, and we'll be talking about that a number of times. It's one of the things a lot of people forget. They'll create a scene, they'll get everything set up, they'll start modifying surfaces, Then they will save the scene, but they'll forget to do a save objects. When they come back, their objects are back to normal. Okay, let's talk about adjusting surface attributes here. And before we do that, think about what makes surfaces look different. For instance, why does one surface actually look different than another? Well, I think there are a few attributes, and these are just standard things. But think about this. Why does a surface look different than the other? Well, there's a few basic things. First off, color. If a surface is a different color, or if it is a different collection of colors. For instance, a label on a video cassette box has a bunch of colors, but still, this is one important attribute, is just color. Another important attribute is shininess. When you cast a light at it, does it have a sheen across it? How does it react with light? Texture is another one. Is the object flat? Is it smooth? Or does it have ripples or bumps? That sort of thing. Also, reflectivity. Does an object reflect other objects around it, or does it just absorb light, not reflective at all? And finally, there's transparency. Can you see through the object, or is it just opaque? Now, we can select attributes for all of those using the Surfaces requester. And let's take those in order, and let's start with the most basic one. Let's start with color. Okay, and let's start by changing the color of that bar that we have selected here. Then we'll load up another object and start to work with that. So let's go to our Surfaces menu. Now, the first key here is you have to pick the surface that you want to work with. So in this case, we want to work with shiny gold metallic. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to start by changing the surface color. So we click on surface color. That brings up this requester, and we have 3 sliders for red, green, and blue. And you can get any of 16.8 million colors by just setting different values for these sliders. If we want a gold, for instance, gold is fairly high red value, and then blue down pretty low and green up a bit. And I'll get sort of a goldish yellow, a little bit more red in it maybe. Now, this is one way you can change these colors. The other way is simply by clicking in the box and then typing in a new value. For instance, if we wanted our red to be 200, we type in 200. You notice the cursor is between the 200 and the 225. If we were to just hit enter here, you notice it enters 200. Watch here. Notice the cursor is before the letter. I don't have to click here at all. I can just start typing. So I'll type in 120, enter, and now I'll type in 5, enter. And you'll notice the value changes to 200, 125. Now this is tremendously useful if you know the value you want to get to. Because if you want to type in, for instance, 240, 125, and 16, you can just click on surface color, type in 240, 125, 16. So I just type in the number, hit enter, and then I move on from there. A lot of times, though, if you're first working with the colors and you're not familiar with the way these RGB sliders interact, you'll want to use the sliders themselves to get a more interactive approach. So let's just set up these colors again, and something like that looks pretty good. Let's hit OK. And let's continue, and we're going to render again. Now, one thing you'll find when you're creating surfaces, the process you go through requires you to render a lot. And that's one of the reasons, one of the first things I did before was I went to my camera menu and I set my resolution to low res. By keeping myself in low resolution, I cut down my render time significantly. Now this is an 040 based Amiga 4000 that we're using right here, and it's a pretty fast machine. However, on an 030 machine, I might even go to super low res in some cases. The problem with super low res to me is that it looks too bad and you can't really make out surfaces. So I try to keep it in low res if I can. So again, now the process that we're going to go through here, and you'll see this once we get into the next object especially, is one that I call cooking, where basically it's the way you cook, if you want to make meals that taste good, is you add a little salt, taste it, add a little pepper, taste it. You don't just add salt, add pepper, add everything, then taste it, and then throw in a whole bunch more ingredients and kind of hope for the best. That's not the way you cook. It's not the way you render here. So what we're going to do is we're going to change these attributes one at a time. Okay, so let's just start and re-render this and see how the color looks. We'll hit F9. And as it renders down, you can see the color has changed. Now, this NewTek logo we've used to prove the point about changing surface names. Let's just go back and change the color of the middle bar on the left. Just show you we can change that. Then let's work with an object that's a little more interesting. And let's hit escape here. And we'll just go back to the other surface, middle bar on left. And let's just change that to sort of purplish. We'll bring our red and blue values up high. And just to prove a point here, let's also go to red bar. And let's make our red bar another green bar. You'll notice the name is red bar, but when we render this out, the computer doesn't care what the names are. All the computer cares about is the surfaces that you assign to those names. Okay, we've done some work with the NewTek logo. Now let's load up an object. One of the things that people often do when they're working with surfaces, and this is the best way to learn surfaces, is to pick a simple shape and then affect changes on that. The way we talked about before, cooking. Change one attribute at a time. And I'm going to use an urn to do that. And the reason I like to use urns is because, first off, they have rounded surfaces on them, and they affect, the way light hits them is more interesting. With a flat, boxy object like this logo, the light, when it hits the surface, because the front face is flat, you don't get a nice sheen or nice glimmer going across the front usually. You have to animate it to really see that. So I use urns because, first off, they have rounded surfaces. Some people use spheres. The reason I use urns is because there's urns in real life, and it's something that you're used to seeing. So let's start by clearing out our scene here and loading up an urn. And let's clear this out. And load up an urn object, also in the tutorials directory. And let's just hit continue. And here is our urn. And we'll go to our camera view. And let's just hit, we have to go to camera view, low res. And let's just hit F9 to get a quick preview of how this looks. This is the default surface for that urn. Okay, as you look at the program monitor, you can see this defaults to a blue surface. And let's change this surface a little bit. Let's hit escape here, go to the surfaces requester, and see what we have for surface names. There's only two surface names here, default, which has no polygons, and urn exterior, which has all the polygons. So all of the polygons for this object are named urn exterior. And one important thing, especially when you're first starting, is sometimes you'll change attributes, you'll render, you won't see anything. Common mistake, common simple mistake, you don't have the right surface selected. So we'll make sure we're changing urn exterior. And let's talk about these attributes, and let's take them in order. And what I'm going to do is, let's start by turning things off. This is the default for the urn exterior. And we've talked about surface color. We can change that in a little bit, but let's talk about smoothing now. Smoothing down here at the bottom affects whether you see the edges of the polygons or not, the faces. And if we hit continue to look at the wireframe preview here, see these individual faces, these individual squares here. Notice the object looks like it's in wireframe. Well, these individual squares here are the surfaces. These are the polygons. If we don't have smoothing on, and it's off now, when we render, we are going to see those, and it's going to be faceted. In other words, it's going to seem very, very squared off. And generally, you don't want this on for curved objects. So here's the way that looks with smoothing turned off. Now, in order to really make this look smooth, you'd need millions and millions of polygons. So what we're doing here is really a trick. Turning smoothing on fakes the computer into making it look smoother. So it's, again, just a hack, basically, that makes polygons, these individual flat surfaces, look smooth. So we will adjust that. We want that back on. And there's also max smoothing angle. What this has to do with is this changes the angle at which two polygons have to be before they're considered smooth. It's set just below 90 degrees. In other words, if polygons are at 90 degrees, then they won't be smooth. Anything less than that will be. And that's a pretty good default setting. I generally never change that. There's occasions when you may want to, but they're few and far between. Okay, now we saw changing color. Let's just change the color on this urn. And again, we'll put it to a sort of goldish surface here. And let's render this out. And of course, in a lot of these, we're cutting out the render times because this does take a few seconds to render, and just to get the most in the tape that we can. For most of the tape here, we cut out the render. So here's the way it looks so far. Now, we talked about color a little bit. Let's talk about shininess now, or the way that light interacts with the object. Now, obviously, the position and type of light that you're using is important here. If you have a light that's aiming at an object that's in front of the object and below it, that's obviously going to make the object look different than if you had a light that was above and behind the object, for instance. It's going to be totally different. Also, if you have a different colored light, that's going to affect the object as well. But there's some other attributes that affect it, and they're part of the surface. These attributes are specularity, diffusion, and glossiness. And let's start by talking about specularity, which is just a 50-cent computer jargon term, basically. It means shininess. The higher the degree of specularity, the more shiny the object is. And you can see that. Let's take a look at our surface requester here. Our specular level is currently set to 100%. If we turn specular to 0%, and I just click in there and hit 0 and hit enter, well, what's going to happen is when our object renders, it's not going to have any hot spots on it. It's not going to look shiny at all. It's going to be a very dull finish, just like you see here on the monitor now. All right. So the higher the specularity, the shinier the object is. And unfortunately, there's no shinometer or anything that you can just aim at an object to figure this out. This is art as much as anything. And just like cooking, individual taste applies here. So your idea of how shiny an object should be is basically should be determined by looking at reality. When you're analyzing an object, if you want to work with something, for instance, if I was working with this glass, I'd say to myself, okay, how shiny is the glass? Well, is it shiny at all? Yeah, it's shiny. How shiny is it? Pretty shiny. So I might go 80%. Try that out. If that doesn't work, go higher or lower, depending upon the results that I see on the screen. And this is why doing things a step at a time is really important. So let's take a look at a graph right now. This shows 4 different levels of shininess. This shows, it's just labeled on the screen there, 0, 33, 66, and 100% specularity. Okay, let's change our specularity. Let's bring that back up to 100%. And there's another attribute that affects specularity, and that's glossiness. And you have 4 settings: low, medium, high, and maximum. Now, a low glossiness means that the hot spot on an object is going to be very spread out, very, very wide. Maximum, which is the highest setting for glossiness, means it's going to be a very, very, very small hot spot. Medium, so again, if we're going up the scale, it's low, medium, high, maximum. Low, the widest hot spot. Medium, a little narrower. High, narrower still. And maximum, extremely narrow, really small. So let's render this with the 2 extreme settings. Let's take a look at low glossiness. So you can see how wide and spread out the hot spot is there. Now let's just go and let's alter it to maximum. Here's maximum glossiness. And this is one good hint, by the way, especially when you're working with surfaces, is go for really different values. If you're trying to see the difference between specularity and you went 50% and then 55%, there's not going to be that much difference. So start at the extremes, then work towards the middle. It's a much better way to go. So here it is with maximum. And here's a chart showing these are all 100% specular. This is, again, it's labeled there, low, medium, high, and maximum. All right, now let's change our glossiness to low here, and let's talk about diffuse level. I sort of have an anti-definition for diffusion. Diffusion controls the brightness of areas that aren't shiny. In other words, and you can see this in the picture right now, we are showing different levels of diffusion, and again, it's 0, 33, 66, and 100%. You see at 100% diffusion, you can see all of the color. You can see all of the blue coming out. Whereas 0% diffusion, the object looks very, very dark. It's black. And you can see how the color diminishes over the different settings here. One thing you'll notice, though, is that the shininess, the hot spot, is the same on all of these pictures. And so what different diffuse settings do is they control how much of the original normal color, the color that you set when you pick your surface color, comes back to the camera. Now, why would you ever use a diffuse setting that's lower? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One I'll show you here is getting a realistic looking metallic surface. And you can see with a specular level of 100%, low glossiness, let's just render this out so we can see how this looks. We've seen this before, but again, we want to do things one step at a time. Now let's adjust our diffusion, and I'm going to bring our diffusion down to 33%. And watch what happens here. This combination of high specularity, spread out hotspot, and low diffusion create a much more metallic look, because if you think about metal, metal is shiny and not much else. So here's the way it looks with that. All right, now there's one other attribute that relates to shininess that we haven't talked about yet, and that's color highlights. And what color highlights does is color highlights affects the hotspot, and it determines whether that hotspot is white, as all the hotspot we've seen so far have been, or if that hotspot takes on the surface color. So let's hit escape to exit here. Let's click on color highlights, and you'll notice when we render this that the hotspots themselves, instead of being as bright white, will actually take on some of the gold color. One thing that should be pointed out here is that the reason our hotspot was white without color highlights turned on is that the light in the scene was white. In other words, if our light in this scene had been blue and we didn't have color highlights on, the hotspot would have been blue. So that's something to watch out for. All right, now we've talked about shininess and color. Let's talk about another very important attribute, and that's reflectivity, the amount of reflection. Now, you'll notice that objects often reflect other objects. Metal's a good example, but there are countless others. Glass, for instance, may seem like it's mostly transparent, but really, in order to see glass, it's very, very important to have those reflections in there. Now, reflection mapping in Lightwave, you have a number of options. You have three major options, and let's talk about those. Now, the first one, of course, is setting a percentage for reflection. So we can set a reflectivity percentage just like we can for any attribute here. All right, now, if our object is 100% reflective, what is it going to reflect? Well, there's three answers to that question. And the most normal one, the one you would expect it to do, is actually the one that's sort of the hardest one to get to. Now, what you'd expect it to do if an object's 100% reflective is you'd expect it to reflect other objects that are around it. Well, let's show you how to do that first, because that's one that you want to do often. And to do that, we need to obviously load up another object here. So let's just load up another object. And from the household directory, we will load up the ashtray. And hit OK here. And let's just position the ashtray. We don't want it to move down on the y-axis, but just move it out in front of the urn a little bit. And keyframe it in place. Okay, so our urn object is now, let's just make sure urn exterior, 100% reflective. And let's hit render here and see how it looks. As you can see, it's not reflecting the object on the urn at all. If you want an object to reflect other objects in the scene, you have to go to the camera menu and turn on trace reflections. Now this turns on what are called ray traced reflections, which is where, again, this is a crude explanation, but basically the computer is tracing, it's following every beam of light and every reflection in the entire scene, and it creates a very, very realistic image. Now the downside to ray traced reflections, and the reason it's not on normally, is because it's very slow. It slows the computer down a little bit. Now this scene, the way we rendered it here, took 14 seconds. Let's hit escape, go to the camera menu, and turn on trace reflections. And let's render this out. Now with trace reflections on, every surface that is reflective, any percentage at all, aside from 0, so it's got any percentage of reflectivity, and you do not have a reflected image chosen, well, it's going to use ray trace reflections for it, and that will slow the computer down a little bit. But on the other hand, it makes a much more realistic image than any other form of reflection mapping. So let's take a look at this as it renders down in program. Now again, this is in low resolution here, so the edges look a little weak, but you can see also if we look at the interface that this took 32 seconds to do. And this is often the only way to get that realistic sort of reflection though. So there are times when you have to use ray trace reflections to get the effect you want. But there are other ways to do it. Now, if you do not have trace reflections on, but you have your reflectivity set to a certain percentage, and in this case we'll leave it set at 100%, what's it going to do? Well, if you don't tell it anything else, what it's going to do is it's going to reflect the background colors. In other words, the colors that you choose from the effects menu. So let's go and let's turn ray traced reflections off here. So we'll go to Effect, Camera. So we'll go to Camera, turn off trace reflection. And now let's go to the effects menu and let's just turn on solid backdrop. Let's turn that off. So now we have these zenith, sky, ground, and nadir colors. And what you'll see is when we render this now, that the object is going to take on those background colors. You can see as it renders to the interface, the colors it's taking on, and then it puts the colors behind it. And the reason we didn't see much before when we rendered is because with just a straight black background color, well, there's not very much to see. That's why the first time we rendered it, we had reflection up to 100%. We didn't have ray tracing on. We rendered the image. It looked just pretty normal like it did before. That's because that one solid background color, you don't have very much to see. Now, the colors spread like this, well, again, I don't know if it's much to look at, but you get some idea there of how it looks. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the reflections currently, in both this example and the ray traced example, are taking on the color of the object itself. In other words, remember this object is gold? Well, let's change our attributes a little bit, and let's make this urn chrome. Let's just make this 100% shiny, a mirror-like surface or a chrome-like surface. Well, there's a couple ways we could do that. Now, if you have your, and think about this, if you had your specular and your diffusion both turned down to 0, how would an object render? Well, the answer is it would render as a completely black object. Because remember, the specular percentage determines how shiny an object is, and diffusion determines how bright the parts that aren't shiny are. 0 specularity means you have no shiny parts. 0 diffusion means the object will render as black. Therefore, the entire object will render as black. But if you also have 100% reflection mapping on, or 100% reflectivity, now the object is going to take on all of its color attributes from the outside world. So let's adjust that here. Let's go back to surfaces, and let's make our urn surface, our urn exterior, 0% diffuse, 0% specular. We'll turn off color highlights as well. And so now 0 specular, 0 diffuse, color highlights is off. And let's just render this with 0% reflectivity to see how this looks. You see as it renders down here, I was not joking, it's rendering completely black. This isn't even the way you would create a black object, because this black is just dead black, nothing. It doesn't show us any detail or it doesn't show us any three-dimensionality of the object at all. If you wanted to make an object that was dark, for instance, like a tire or a black urn, what I would do is I would use a very low surface color number. So I'd set my colors down low, but I would give it diffuse and specular numbers. Otherwise, it's going to look like this, which is just flat and two-dimensional. Okay, now this is with our surface attributes, diffuse, specular, set to 0, color highlights off. Now let's turn reflectivity back on, 100%. And now, if you take a look, what it's going to do is, remember, ray trace reflections are off here. What it's going to do is it's going to take just the background colors, it's going to reflect those, and it's almost acting like chrome here, because it has no color attributes of its own to show through. Now, we get the same effect if we were to now turn on ray traced reflections. So let's turn on ray traced reflections. We go to the camera view, trace reflections, it warns us it may take more time. And as it renders down here, you'll see it reflects not only the background colors, but also the object itself and the ashtray there. Okay, so far so good. It's important to understand this. Now remember, the higher your diffuse value, the more of the color it brings in. In other words, the more of the color you can see. So what would happen here is if I were to raise my diffuse value a little bit, and let's try that. Let's try raising diffuse. Remember, our surface color is still set to that gold. Let's raise diffuse to 20%. As it renders down here, you see it is taking on a little more of the color there, particularly in the upper part there. It's taking on a little of the color, but not very much. Now, it's important to understand the way these attributes interact with each other. Generally, by the way, you're not going to use 100% reflectivity. Most objects, let's say a shiny marble floor, I found about 20-25% reflectivity works just great for that. And you don't need very much more than that to get a really nice, realistic-looking surface. And we'll show that a little bit later. Now, one thing that's going on here, though, is with 100% reflections, the thing you'd use that for mostly is mirrors. And to do a realistic-looking mirror, I would do 0 diffuse, 0 specular, turn reflection all the way up, and turn on trace reflections. Now you've got a mirror surface. For water or something like that, similar thing, except even with water, I wouldn't use 100% reflection. If you want a metallic looking water, well, you could do that, I guess. And again, chrome, any of those surfaces, you'd use 100% reflections. Almost anything else, you keep your numbers fairly low, but remember that your diffusion and specular are still interacting here. All right, let's just recap what we've gone over with reflection mapping here. If you turn reflectivity up, let's say to 100%, and you do not turn trace reflections on, it's going to reflect the background colors. Now, if you turn trace reflections on, it's going to reflect the background colors and any objects in the scene. Now, we've got one other method that we can use here to create reflections. That's called reflection mapping. With reflection mapping, we use an image. We load a picture up, basically. And then we can set the object to reflect that image. So let's start by loading an image up. And we will hit Escape here, go to the Images section, and load the Fractal Reflections image. This comes with the toaster. It's called Fractal Reflections. And here's the way it looks. It's just a sort of grainy pattern of blacks and whites. And let's go back to our surface here. And you see right below reflectivity is reflection image. And again, this opens up, and we can select any image we want to. Now, with an image chosen, even if you have ray tracing turned on, it will ignore, this surface will ignore the ray tracing and just reflect that image. And this is very, very handy. It means that you can combine ray traced reflections and reflection mapping in the same scene. Now, with reflection mapping on, it's going to reflect that image. So where is the image? Well, the answer is the image isn't actually in any physical location in the scene. The image, you can think of it as completely surrounding the scene. So wherever the image turns, there's the image there. And it's almost like the image is wrapped around a giant sphere which surrounds the universe. Now, it's like that, but it's not that. In other words, if you aim the camera, you'll never see the image. You're only going to see the image reflected in objects. So let's leave our reflectivity up to 100%. We've chosen fractal reflections. And let's continue and hit render to see how this looks. We're also keeping a little bit of the diffusion. Remember, we turned the diffusion up to 20%. It's keeping that. Now, what does this look like? Nothing good right now. And if you want to create realistic metals on a surface like this, this is not the way to do it. So what use is reflection mapping? Well, it's actually got a tremendous amount of uses. And the biggest one is for flying logos. If you're doing a flying logo and you want it to look metallic, and you want the logo flying through space and it looks like metal rippling across it, this is a very, very, very common look for logos, by the way, you'd want to use reflection mapping. And the reason why, and this is a standard technique in 3D graphics for years now, the reason they use reflection mapping is because it's quick. It's a lot quicker than ray tracing, and for logos, gets just the results you want. So let's finish talking about attributes here, then we'll do a logo project a little later and show you the real payoff for reflection mapping. And the next attribute we want to talk about is transparency. Let's just turn off reflectivity here. And we will turn no reflection image on. With no reflectivity, we don't want that on. And let's just set our diffuse level back to 100%. Let's set our specular back to 100%. And our glossiness to medium, and just render this out. We've changed a bunch of attributes. Again, normally if you're just experimenting and trying to learn how the attributes work, I would change them one at a time. We've discussed these already. So here's the way our urn looks so far. All right, and let's talk about the way transparency works. Transparency is pretty straightforward, it would seem. You set a percentage. 0% is fully opaque, 100% is fully transparent, and the object will show up as transparent. So let's just go to surfaces here. 100% transparent we won't bother with because that would be completely invisible. Let's make it 50% transparent and hit render here. And transparency, like ray trace reflections, transparency will really slow the scene down. Transparency can add quite a bit of time to a scene, particularly when you start to use some of the advanced options. Now, one of the most common things you probably think of as transparent is something like glass. So if we set transparency to 50%, we should get a real nice looking realistic glass surface here, correct? Well, let's take a look. Well, not exactly. To my mind, that doesn't really look much like glass. Now, if you look at the time on the interface, by the way, you'll notice that this took 29 seconds, so it's nearly twice as slow as it was when our urn was just normal with no transparency set. Now, glass is one of the most common things you use transparency for, but let's think about the way glass actually is in reality. If you look at glass, there's a few things going on there, and only one of them is transparency. The other one, of course, is reflections. A realistic glass surface reflects the objects around it. And this is why often, if you have plate glass windows, for instance, what happens on a nice summer day is you might accidentally walk through the plate glass window, particularly if someone's just cleaned it. And the reason why is because the glass, being transparent, means you can't see it. One of the few reasons you see glass actually is because of the transparency. That's part of it, but also the reflection. And often, in the case of glass, there's stuff on it. There's dust or something on it that makes you be able to see it. So if you want a realistic glass surface, you've got to do a lot more than transparency. Now, you've got to do a lot more than reflection mapping, too, and that's because transparency has other attributes that work with it. So let's talk about some of those other attributes here. We go to the Surfaces requester. You see that under transparency, we have these buttons: color filter, refractive index, edge transparency, and edge threshold. Now, let's start by talking about color filter. This is pretty straightforward. What color filter does, if you turn color filter on, it means that any objects behind this transparent surface will take on the surface color. In other words, if we had another object behind this urn, for instance a steel bar, if we didn't have color filter on, we'd still see that steel bar in its normal color. With color filter on, it would be as though the steel bar were really behind the object, and therefore what you'd have is sort of a metallic goldish look on that steel bar. And I've got some frames here that show this. This is just with normal transparency mapping, and this is with color filter turned on. Now, another thing that's going to affect you here is the double-sidedness of a surface. Now, let's take a brief time out to talk about that for a second, and it has to do with polygon facing. Every polygon, every face in an object can face generally one of two directions. It's either facing out or in. And the reason for that is the more polygons the computer has to render, the longer the scene takes. So generally you set your polygons to face either out or in. If you were modeling, for instance, a brick or something like that, you'd want all the polygons to face outwards. So you just have a square box, you want the polygons facing outwards because you're always going to stay outside that brick. Now on the other hand, if you were modeling a room, you might use a similar object, a box, but you'd want the polygons flipped inwards because the camera is going to be inside that box. Now, if you were going to have the camera go in and outside of an object, what you might do is you might turn on double-sided. And with this urn, that's what's going on. This urn really only has faces that project outwards. And we can see that if we turn double-sided off. And let's just set our transparency back to 0 here for a second. Let's turn double-sided off. And let's move our camera above and rotate it down so we can kind of see into the urn here. Let's just move it up a little bit more. All right, and let's hit render. And what you'll see here is we're seeing the front faces, the outer face is fine, but it's not rendering the back faces at all. Looks like the object turns invisible there. Now there's two ways you could change that. There's two ways you could fix this problem. One of them is in Modeler, you could assign these surfaces and make each one of these polygons double-sided. But the quicker way, and perhaps the better way, because it makes the object take up less space, is to use the double-sided option. And with the double-sided option on in our Surfaces menu here, we click on double-sided, and now you'll notice we see the outer polygons, but also the inner polygons, the back polygons. All right, now when you're working with transparent objects, this becomes very important. Because with transparent objects, and let's talk about a box again, for instance. If your object is transparent, let's think about a flat plane like a box. Well, if the planes are both facing outwards, what you're going to see is you're going to see this surface, and if your object's opaque, it doesn't make any difference. You're fine. Move the camera around to the other side, you'll see the back face. It's fine. But as soon as it becomes transparent, you start to get into problems. Because what's going to happen now is, since this front face is transparent, you should be able to see the back face, but since double-sided normally is not on, This back face, since you're going to be seeing the interior of it, is going to be invisible. So often when you have transparent surfaces, you'll need to make sure you turn double-sided on. And again, this is 2 frames here. This one shows double-sided on. This one shows double-sided off. This is a big step in getting a glass surface realistic, is make sure you turn double-sided on. Now again, this slows down render time because it has to render twice as many polygons, but we want realistic glass, this is what you have to go through. Okay, so so far we've added, let's bring us back to 50%. We've added color filter, and we've talked about double-sided. Now let's talk about the next attribute, which is edge transparency. Now, in a transparent object like this, your edges are uniform normally. In other words, they default to the entire object being the same transparency. But that's not necessarily desirable. That's why you have these 3 buttons here that determine edge transparency, and it's opaque, normal, and transparent. With opaque on, the edges of the object will now take on opacity. In other words, you'll be able to see the edges of the object. They'll be visible. Now, with transparency set on, what will happen is the edges of the object will render as completely transparent. And both of these have their uses. Now, with an object like glass, for instance, we want the object's edge transparency to be opaque. In other words, we'll set it to opaque. Now, the frames you've been seeing, here it is with color filter double-sided turned on, and here it is with opacity turned on. Now, the other option here is transparent edges, and there's a number of uses for that. One use for that is if you want an object like a cloud, for instance, where you don't want to really see the edges of the polygon. You just want it to sort of fade in from the sides. Now, there's an attribute that works with edge transparency and opacity, and that's the edge threshold. The lower the edge threshold, the shorter the distance. In other words, how big is the edge of the object? Well, you can set that by setting your edge threshold. So the lower the number, for instance, when you have opacity set, the tighter that edge where you can see that visible edge will be. The wider it is, the more it'll be focused in. So let's just reset up our scene here. And I just want to move my camera back down and kind of rotate it out again. All right, and let's set our surfaces here. 50% transparency. Let's set our edge transparency to opaque and render this. Okay, now this is your edge transparency set to opaque, and your edge threshold set to 1.0. And you'll notice that it's transparent in the middle, but towards the edges it's very opaque. But you'll also notice not very much of the center is really that transparent. And again, we adjust that using the edge threshold. So let's drop our edge threshold down. Let's change it, let's adjust it by half. So we'll change it from 1 to 0.5 and re-render this. As you see here, much more of the center is now transparent. By adjusting that edge threshold downward, what's happened is we've made the edges, they're still opaque, but there's not as much of the edge that's opaque. Much more of it's transparent. And again, if we were to adjust it upwards, what you'd see is then that less of it was transparent, far more of it was opaque. This is one of those things you'll definitely want to play around with and experiment to try to get the best look. Okay, now finally, in the examples we've been showing you there of that blue vase, let's just finally add reflectivity. And this is the final thing that adds a lot. Now, it adds a lot in terms of 2 areas. It adds a lot of realism, and it adds a lot of time. This frame took far longer than any of the other ones. But if you'll take a look at it, you'll see that it is a pretty darn realistic frame. And the only thing we've added there is just now it's also reflective, and we've got ray traced reflections on. Now, so far, all the examples that we've seen of changing color, reflectivity, transparency, and shininess, we've been using one attribute. In other words, we've been making our object 100% specular or 50% specular, but the entire object is 50% or 100% specular, the entire surface. And especially when it comes to color, there's times when you don't want that. In other words, you often don't want a surface just to be red, but you might want it to be red and white, or red, white, and blue, or red, white, and blue with a picture of someone on the cover and something else going on. So you might want a much more complex setting than the ones that we've done. And that's what you use textures for. You'll notice in the interface that a lot of these buttons here have the little T next to them, and T stands for texture. Now, what texture allows you to do, and there's two types of textures, procedural textures and image maps. Textures allow you to assign different values for any of these settings to the same surface. So for instance, rather than having an object that is 50% specular, you can have an object that's 50% specular and 100% specular, depending on where you are on the surface. So different parts of the surface can have different values. And this is where you start to get into creating really, really realistic surfaces. So let's talk about textures, and first let's talk about the difference between the two types, procedurals and image maps. So let's start by clearing our scene out. And let's just go into Modeler and make a 1 by 1 by 1 cube. In other words, a cube that's just 1 meter on each side, 1 meter this way, and this way. So to do that, let's just go to an empty layer here. Under the Objects menu, select Box, and we'll just drag it out in one dimension. Now we will drag it out in another one. And I can see that my grid size here, by the way, is 50 centimeters. So if I make it 2 cubes long, it'll be 1 meter by 1 meter. And just to make sure we're there, I'll hit Numeric. And it shows me -50, +50, it adds up to 1 meter. Hit OK. And let's just click on Make. And here is our object. So we have a 1 meter by 1 meter cube. Let's save this with a good name like Cube. And let's exit back to the layout program. Now you'll notice we didn't assign any surface name for it. Does that mean that there's no surface assigned for this cube? Not at all. There's always a surface name assigned to any surface. And let's just load up the object here and see what that surface name is. Usually, by the way, all other things being equal, it's default. In this case, though, it's shiny gold metallic. Why is that? If you don't remember, rewind the tape to the beginning, and when we created surfaces in Modeler at the very beginning of the tape, the last surface that we assigned someplace was called shiny gold metallic. So this new surface that's been created was created with that name. Now, we can rename, we could go back into Modeler now and rename this surface if we want to, but since this is the only object in the scene, we've got another option that's much simpler. That's using Rename Surface. We click on Rename, and we will clear out this requester, and we'll just type in Cube, and hit Return, and now what was called shiny gold metallic is now called Cube. So again, we could have gone into Modeler, selected those polygons, done a rename, but this is simpler, and since this is the only object in the scene, there's no real danger in it. Okay, so let's just go in, and let's just take our cube here, and from the camera view, let's take the object and rotate it a little bit. So we're looking at it slightly sideways. Remember, this face right here is the front face that was facing us when we went into the program, when we loaded the object up. We'll keyframe it, and let's just also take our light and rotate that a little bit so it's hitting the object a little more straight on. Okay, and let's just go to low res because we're previewing surfaces here. Hit F9, and this will render up the surface with its default settings, which are normally your color set to 200, 200, 200, diffuse and specular off, transparency, reflectivity off, smoothing off, pretty much everything off, including double-sided. So here's our object so far. Big thrill, not exactly a stellar object thus far. Now let's talk about, first off, procedurals. And the way procedurals work, they're one of the types of textures that you have, and they're pretty straightforward. Procedurals use 2 values. And the first value is based on the ones that we've been setting already, for instance, surface color. So let's start by creating a procedural texture for surface color. We will go to Surfaces. Here is Surface Color. And let's make this red. Now, by hitting T, will bring us into this texture requester. So the first thing we need to decide when this requester comes up is what texture type we're going to use. And we can just hold down the left mouse button to move between our texture types. Now, the first 5 ones here, planar, cylindrical, spherical, cubic, and front projection image map, those are all image maps. Let's start with procedurals, though, which are checkerboard, grid, dots, marble, wood, underwater, and fractal noise. We'll start with the most simple one, which is checkerboard. Now, again, what we're using here is we're using 2 different values. One value we've already set. That's the surface color outside, and we've set that to be red. Now just think of that as a value, though. So one value is red. The other value we set in this requester. So the values are set below here and below this line, and with checkerboard it's a pretty easy surface. Texture color determines the value that we want to set in here, and we'll set this to white. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to have a surface that's not one color, it's two colors. And the two colors are red and white, our surface color and our texture color. Now, these other attributes up here, texture size, center, texture fall-off and velocity, and world coordinates, these apply to almost every texture type. In other words, you have these buttons on almost every texture type. Let's talk about those as they relate to the checkerboard surface. Checkerboard surface creates a checkerboard pattern between two values, in this case the color is red and white, and it makes the size of the checkerboard squares whatever size you set here in texture size. So if we make our texture size 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, each one of our checkerboard squares will be 1/4 of a meter. So that means we will have basically 4 by 4 by 4 on this surface. So let's see how this looks. Let's hit F9 to render it. And there you go. You see the checkerboard pattern forming. And again, the color is determined by a combination of surface color and texture color. Okay, so here is our cube. Let's hit escape and talk about some of the other values here. Now, texture center determines where that value starts. And if you look at the program monitor here, you can see that the squares are being cut off on the edges. And the reason for that is we have a 1 meter, let's just pretend we're looking at one face. The face itself is 1 meter. The texture center is defaulting to the center of this cube, right in the middle. And if it's putting 4 cubes, in other words, each square is 0.25 across this 1 meter surface, well, it's putting one right in the center, then one right next to that, one right next to that, and then it starts to run out of room. So what happens is you end up getting half of the cube on each face. If we wanted these checkerboard squares to line up perfectly through the edges, not to be cut off, we'd have to move our texture center. And we'd have to move our texture center by half the size of the texture. In other words, our texture size is 0.25. So if we were to move this 0.125, which is half of 0.25, and re-render, this will push the texture center over, and now what you're going to see is, you're going to see that these squares line up perfectly. Okay, so this is the effect of changing the texture center. Now the next attribute, texture velocity, lets us animate the texture center. In other words, basically it moves the texture center. And the effect that this has is it makes it look as though the texture is moving across the surface of the object. So we're going to select texture velocity, and let's say give it 0.05 units per frame. Units here is meters, and this means it will move 0.05 or 50 millimeters every frame. Now, since it's moving 50 millimeters each frame, that means over 30 frames, or 1 second, it's going to move 1,500 millimeters, which is 1.5 meters. Math. You have to do it here. So what we're talking about is the velocity set to 50 millimeters, or 0.05. That's going to give us 1.5 meters worth of movement every second. And that means since our cube here is 1 meter, this is going to be quick. The texture is going to be moving very, very fast along this. Now, if we were to cut this down, for instance, make it just 5 millimeters, now we've got something a little bit more human. It's going to be moving 1/10 the speed. And in other words, we're going to slowly be moving this image across the x-axis. You can see it's just x here. And this will create a pretty nice looking pattern. Otherwise, it's going to be too darn fast. Now, here's the big question. Why would you want to do this? Why would you want to make the checkerboard pattern move across the surface? And, well, I don't have a real good use for doing that with checkerboards usually. But with some of the other patterns, understanding velocity is crucial, and you'll see that as we move on. This is just to make sure, since we're working with the basic, simple texture here, that you understand this. This would make that move across. And let's take a look at an animation that uses that. This animation here is just with the velocity setting the way we've shown it. Now, texture fall-off is the next attribute. And what texture fall-off does is it lets you get rid of the effects of the attribute. So, for instance, by falling off the texture, we would get rid of this texture color. And let's just reset our center back to 0 here and turn our velocity off. And if we were to set our fall-off, and again, this is percentage per unit, which means percentage per meter. Since this is a 1 meter cube, if we were to set our fall-off to be, say, 20% per meter, what would happen is, after 5 meters, it would be 100% fallen off. Therefore, we would no longer see the value that we've set in here, in this case, texture color. We would just see the value we set outside, which was our red color, that value. Now, let's make our value fall off here really rapidly. And what we'll do is we'll make it 50% fall off, which means after 2 meters, the entire white color will be gone. So we'll set it 50% on all sides. And let's render this out. And what you'll see is it will start with the checkerboard pattern. In the center, it's going to look fine, but you'll see it's going to start to fade out as we get towards the edges here. And if we were to set our value to something higher, for instance, 100% fall off, what's going to happen now when we render is you're going to see that you see very, very little. By the time it gets to the edges of the cube, the surface has completely vanished. So we're just left with a normal red cube. Now again, there's times when you'll want to do this. And one good example of that here that uses a checkerboard surface is if you were doing a checkerboard floor that extends off into the distance. The problem is, as it gets way into the distance, you start to get all kinds of aliasing problems as the checkerboards meet, as the pattern gets smaller. So what you might want to do is, let's say you had the camera looking at this checkerboard floor that was 1,000 meters long. What you might want to do is, after a couple of 100 meters, have the surface fall off. So in the foreground, you have the checkerboard surface, but in the distance, it's fallen off just to the red color, for instance. That would look fine, and that would avoid any of the aliasing problems that you might get when you have a checkerboard surface like this. You'll find there's other uses for the fall-off attribute as well. Okay, finally, let's talk about world coordinates. Well, world coordinates changes is whether the texture center, for instance, is based on the object or is based on the actual universe. If we were to set our texture center to 0.5, in other words, to half a meter above, 0.5 on the y-axis, normally that would mean that the texture center is on the object moved up. But if you turn world coordinates on, it means that the texture center is actually at 0.5 in the universe. And what that would mean is, as the object moved through that point, the surface would change. Now, this animation, you're looking at 2 cubes moving up and down. The one on the left has the texture center. They both have the same texture center, but the one on the left does not have world coordinates on. The one on the right has world coordinates on. And you can see the one on the left, the pattern is moving with the cube, whereas the one on the right, it looks like the cube is moving through the pattern. All right, we've discussed the checkerboard texture. Now let's go to a more complex texture, the grid texture. And when I say more complex, this isn't much more complex. If you look at the checkerboard texture, you see we have all these buttons plus texture color. With grid, we have all those buttons, texture color, and line thickness. So let's just reset these. Texture size 0.25 I'm happy with. Fall off, let's just set that back to 0. Center is at 0, and then velocity is at 0. And world coordinates is off. Now the grid texture creates a grid pattern. Again, pretty straightforward. And it uses the 2 colors that you've chosen, the red that we picked outside and the white that we've chosen here, or whatever values you choose. And texture size now determines how big the grid squares are. Now the other attribute that we have here is line thickness. A line thickness of 1.0 means that the lines will be as thick as the current size. In other words, your lines will completely fill in the size. On the other hand, a value of, let's say, 0.5 means that the thickness of your lines will be 50% of your grid size. This is important to note. Line thickness here is not an absolute value. 1 doesn't mean, for instance, 1 meter, as it does for texture size. 1 means 100%. So if we set it to 0.2, which is its default value, That means that each one of these lines will be 20% of the thickness. Let's render this out and see the grid texture. Okay, and so this is the way the grid pattern looks. And again, this is just low res, which is why it looks kind of jaggy and not that great looking. And all the other attributes work just the way you'd expect them to. So you could apply velocity to this, set a fall off, any of those attributes. Okay, the next procedural texture, a little more complex, is dots. Not that much more complex, though. We now have dot diameter. Texture size determines how far apart the dots are. Dot diameter works very similarly to, in the grid function, the way the line thickness works, determines a percentage here. So if we use this texture, you'll see that the dots are 60% of the distance between things. If we were to set it to 1, the dots would completely overtake the texture. Now, these procedurals that we've seen so far, checkerboard, grid, and dots, are all very, very straightforward, simple textures, and they don't really add that much to your render time. The same isn't true, though, of the next few, and particularly the next ones we're going to talk about here, which are marble and wood. Now, the idea behind the marble and wood textures is that marble and wood should allow you to create realistic marble and wood. Makes sense. Well, they don't really work that way. And in fact, the best way to create realistic marble and wood surfaces is to use image mapping, which we'll talk about later. These procedurals don't work that well. They never look as realistic as, for instance, a picture of marble or wood would look. And also, they're much slower than just image mapping. So let's just take a look, very, very quick look at these. But remember, you really shouldn't use these. You should just use marble and wood. Frequencies determines the amount of detail in the pattern. Now, when we're talking about these patterns here, you'll see frequencies come up a few times in the next few procedurals here. And again, frequencies determines the amount of detail. The lower the number, the less detail there is in the procedural texture. The higher the number, the more detail there is. Generally, you want to keep this somewhere between about 1 and 6 or so. Turbulence determines how much the marble veins will move over. Vein spacing determines the amount of distance between the veins. And finally, vein sharpness determines how sharp those veins are. Again, the higher the number here, the sharper the vein will be. The lower the number, the more contrasty the vein will be, so it will just show up. It will sort of ease into the vein more. And let's just use this texture and hit F9 to render here and see how this looks. And this is the way the marble pattern looks. And again, you'll see that it does render much slower than the other patterns we've seen. And does it look like marble? Well, kinda. Looks kind of like a zebra, too, so if you're modeling that zebra, this might be the pattern for you. So let's exit out of here, and let's just change turbulence here. This is an important attribute to be able to change. By adjusting the turbulence, what's going to happen is, adjusted to 0.9, you're going to see that the lines themselves, the veins themselves, are much more all over the place. Again, the lower the turbulence number, the straighter those veins will be. With a higher turbulence, what's happening is they're moving a lot more. Now, again, these don't produce really that realistic surfaces, and the best way to do these is image maps. Let's just talk about wood real briefly, too. And we'll be talking about some of these attributes, though, particularly sharpness and frequencies, more when we talk about the other procedurals. Next procedural we want to talk about is wood. And wood, you have turbulence, the same way that you did for marble. You've also got ring spacing and ring sharpness. And you'll see that these sharpness attributes show up in a few of these, again, as frequencies do. Ring spacing just determines how far the rings are from each other. We'll just go with these default settings. And not particularly wood-like. Again, wood is one of those ones I would definitely just end up using an image map for. But just to show you how it looks, here's the way it renders. Okay, I think I've warned you enough about these surfaces. So let's go on to a couple more useful ones. Underwater is the next one, and this can be very, very useful. And let's select underwater. And what underwater does is it creates realistic ripples, as though you'd thrown a stone into a pond, for instance. And this can be very, very useful, very, very good looking, not just for water effects, but also for some things you might not think of, like clouds in the sky, or just strange sort of psychedelic patterns. Now, let's look at the attributes here. We have wave sources. This is how many pebbles you've thrown into the pond, basically. And we'll set this to 1 wave source initially. Wavelength determines how far the waves are from each other. In other words, if this is one wave, how far is the next wave? Wave speed determines how fast those waves move. And band sharpness, again, is like sharpness in our other attributes, determines how sharp, how contrasty that band is, each individual wave is. Now, the way you animate this is by using wave speed. You do not use velocity here. So that's important to know if you're going to animate this texture. And these, again, look best animated. So let's just use this texture, but let's go out and change our colors here. So let's make this color blue, sort of a lightish, sort of greenish blue, instead of red. All right, now let's go in and let's set the other color. We set one color to a lightish blue. Let's set the other color in here, and we will change that to a darker blue. And our texture center is right in the middle, 0, 0, 0. We have one wave source. Our wavelength is 0.5. Well, this is a 1 meter object, so let's make this a little bit smaller, maybe 0.3. We'll leave our wave speed and band sharpness right where they are for now. So this is like we're throwing a stone into the pond, one stone, because we only have one wave source set. And what you'll see when this renders out is you're going to see the ripples, and it's like we've thrown a stone right into the middle here, and you're getting the ripple pattern. Now let's adjust these attributes a little bit more. And one of the first ones we can change here is the number of wave sources. Let's change this to 3, so it's like we're throwing 3 stones in. And don't forget, if you were to throw stones into a pond, you wouldn't just get the ripples moving out, but the ripples at some point would hit each other and start to interact, and you'd get a much more complex pattern. And that's just what happens here. We change our wave sources to 3, you'll see this is a much more complex pattern. All right, now let's adjust that band sharpness. And again, remember, the higher the sharpness number, the tighter the bands will be. So let's just take a look at that. It defaults to 2. Let's bring it up to 6. You can see there's much more contrast between them. Okay, so you can adjust these settings, and again, you can make pretty realistic water by combining some of these. Now, one thing we haven't talked about yet is wave speed, and wave speed is only going to affect you here when you animate. Now, the wave speed determines how far each wave will travel, and again, this is per frame. So here's the formula that you'd use, and what you do is you're dividing wavelength by the number of frames that you want to be a complete cycle, and that results in what your wave speed number should be. So for instance, with a wavelength of 0.3, let's say I wanted this to repeat over 30 frames. I'd have to divide 30 into 0.3, and that would determine what my wave speed should be, and this is where our friend the calculator comes in handy. And again, this is just beats doing real math. What we do is we divide 0.3, and we'll divide that by 30 frames, and that gives us 0.01. So that means that our wave speed should be 0.01 in this case. It's going to be pretty quick, but let's just set that anyway. So 0.01 for our wave speed. Now let's bring our band sharpness back down. And let's just take away the way this would look animated, and you're just seeing basically a 1-second loop here, but you'll notice that it's looping perfectly. Finally, let's talk about the last procedural type, and that's fractal noise. Now, fractals are a mathematics of nature. And basically, what fractals do is they produce random patterns, but they're not too random. And an example of fractals that comes up all the time is cloud patterns, for instance, or the edge of a seashore, for instance. These are patterns that are random. There's no repeating to them, but on the other way, and they're not crazy random. They're not anarchy. So let's go to fractals here and see what we have for settings. And you'll notice you have the same settings we had before. You also have frequencies and contrast. And remember, frequencies determines the amount of detail in a pattern. Contrast determines whether you've got a sharp or a sort of dulled edge as you move from value to value, in this case from color to color. Now we'll leave the color settings where we had them before. We'll leave frequencies right where we have them too. And the important thing to note here is texture size. Texture size determines how big the fractal pattern is. So let's start by setting it to 0.5, or half a meter. We'll leave frequencies right where it is. We'll leave contrast where it is, and see the way this draws. Now, since this will only be half the cube, this is going to be a rather large fractal pattern, rather large random pattern, but you'll see it does give us 2 colors, and since our contrast is fairly low, it seems to fade between the 2 colors here. So here's the way this looks rendered. And again, the cube, you can see it does have a sort of cloud-like, a nice natural randomness to it. Now, if we were to adjust our texture size down, you're going to see that the pattern becomes smaller. And so let's adjust it now, and let's make a pretty big jump here. We'll adjust the texture size to 0.05, so it's a tenth the size that it was before. And now what you'll see is a much smaller pattern. Now one nice thing about fractals, and here it comes as it renders down, is that they don't repeat. So if you were to give this velocity and move the fractal pattern along, you would never see a repetition. And that's one of the problems with image maps, by the way, is eventually you start to see the pattern. It's almost like the old Saturday morning cartoons where a coyote's chasing a roadrunner across the screen, and you eventually, if you watch the background, you'd see the same tree going by every 5 seconds or whatever. It's the same problem when you use image mapping. Your eye can pick up on that, and eventually it sort of breaks the illusion. Now with fractal patterns, because it's a random pattern, it's constantly changing, if you were to give this velocity, you'd never see an exact repeat. So it's very, very handy, although the render times are, again, longer than if you're just using a normal color or an image map. Okay, let's also talk about the other attribute we can change of fractals here. Let's change our frequencies to 1, and this will be the same size, but you're going to notice that the pattern has much less detail. And it's going to be exactly the same pattern, but again, there'll just be less detail around the edges. And one thing that'll do, lowering the frequencies in any of these procedurals, lowering the frequencies decreases the amount of render time. Increasing the frequencies increases the amount of render time. I usually set it to 2, something around there. 1, often I can get away with 1, and that's generally, if I can get away with it, I'll use that because it takes less time. Let's adjust it upwards. Let's adjust it to 6. And what you'll see here as it renders down is, again, the same pattern, but a lot more inlets in it. And if you were to move close to this, you could move very, very close, and there's just a lot more detail to the pattern. Let's just adjust this back down to about 2 and render this out. And I just want to get something set so when we change the contrast, you'll be able to see the difference here, but it won't take as long. So this is with the frequencies of 2. And let's adjust our contrast. Remember, the lower the contrast, the less contrast there is between things. There's no better way to say it, really. The higher the contrast, the more stark the difference is between the two values. So let's start by raising the contrast. Let's raise it up to 6. And what you'll see here is there's areas that are blue or white, and there's not too much in between there. And again, this pattern here, as it renders out, will show you, think of it, whereas before it's been looking like clouds and things, you'll see in this pattern it's starting to look like the hide of a cow or something like that. In fact, if you want to, take a look at the cow object that comes with the toaster, and it uses a fractal pattern for the hide of the cow. Now, if we were to adjust our contrast down, remember it defaults to 1. Let's adjust it to a really low number, like 0.5. And what you're going to see then is, you're going to see it's almost hard to tell where one starts and the other one stops. It's just a very subtle pattern. And this, of course, is one of the best uses of fractals, by the way, is to often add just a little bit of dirt. And one thing that I'll do is, if you look at objects in reality, very seldom, even a wall, for instance, in an apartment or something, very seldom is that wall just white. Usually through time, it has taken on other colors for reasons that we won't go into here, but basically things deteriorate over time. So what I would do is, if I wanted to make an object look more realistic, rather than assigning it just one color, I'd assign it 2 colors. One color, let's say white for the wall, and then sort of a dingier gray. Give it a fractal texture to assign that other color. Give it a low contrast. And I would also give it a low frequency, since I don't need too much frequencies to get the effect. And this will give your objects a little bit more of a realistic look. Reality is a dirty business. So here's the way it looks with a low contrast. Now, that's the way your procedural textures work. Now let's talk about image map textures, the other type of texture that you have. To use image map textures, you have to load an image up first. So let's load an image up. We'll hit escape, and let's remove the texture here. You see the light's no longer on, so we no longer have a texture. And we will load up an image, and we will load from the wood directory the light wood image, and this comes with the toaster. Now, whereas a procedural uses the value that you set, for instance, the color that you set, and you set a value inside, the texture color, for instance, the examples we've shown, images don't work that way. Images completely cover up the values that you chose in front. So, for instance, our current value right now for our color, we've loaded the image up. Our current value for color is this sort of light blue. Now, Let's go to texture and talk about image maps. What you're going to see here is when we use an image map, we will not see the blue anymore. That value will be completely covered up by the image. Now, image mapping is the best way to get extremely realistic surfaces. If you're using something like wood or marble or grass or stone or anything like that, the best way to make them look realistic is to use image maps, because what you're literally doing is taking a picture of the image, wood, marble, grass, or stone, and mapping it onto a surface. And this can look incredibly realistic. Now, let's start with talking about planar image mapping. In a planar image map, what you're doing is you're taking an image and you're mapping it onto a flat plane. And let's talk about the basic procedure here. The first thing you need to do is tell the computer which image you want to use. We've already loaded up one. We'll go to texture image and we'll choose light wood. Now, you have these other attributes that you've seen here before. It's texture size, center. These are very, very important. Your texture size needs to be just right for the image to map properly. You want the image size to be basically the size of the surface usually. So for instance, if we want this picture of wood to fit exactly on the sides of this cube, it needs to be the same size as the cube, in this case 1 by 1 by 1. We also want the texture center to be right so the image is centered properly on the surface. Now, this is usually work, and that's why there's a great button called automatic sizing. This will do it for you automatically. It will automatically fit the image onto whichever surface you choose. So the first thing I do is, again, pick the image, then I click automatic sizing, and now the question in planar image maps is which texture axis to use, X, Y, or Z. Now the way you can think of this is if this is our image, you have to determine which axis it's going to map onto. You have three choices, X, Y, or Z. In planar image map, you can basically think of the image as being stuck to whichever plane. Now, if we want to map this image onto the front of our cube, well, think of a line that moves through the image, and which axis is it moving through? Well, if you remember from our basic discussion, it's moving through the Z-axis. So if we want it on the front face, it would be the Z-axis. If on the other hand we wanted the image flat, like on the ground or on the ceiling, well, picture a line moving through the image, and now this is moving in the Y-axis. If we want this mapped on the side, again, now it's moving through the X-axis. So let's start by mapping our light wood image onto the front face, which is the Z-axis, the axis that moves in and out of the screen. So we'll set the texture axis to Z. We've got automatic sizing done. Now we'll just use texture, and let's continue here. Remember, this face right here, the one that's now facing the upper left corner, this face right here is our front face. And you'll see it goes through and filters the image. It does this once when you have anti-aliasing set. But as it goes through here, you'll see that front face looks perfect. It looks like realistic wood. Now the problem comes on the other faces. Because in a planar image map, you're only mapping the image onto one plane, what happens is it doesn't map properly onto the other planes. So even though this looks great on the Z-axis, on the X and Y-axis, it doesn't look that good. In other words, what it's doing is basically it's taking the color from each pixel there and just extending it off into infinity. Now, in this case, it might be acceptable. You don't have the same amount of detail as you do on the front face, on the two side faces, but it looks okay. Let's just adjust planar image map here, and let's put it onto the other axes. Here is Y. Now what this is going to do is this is going to cause it, as you'll see here, to render properly on the bottom axis, but not on the front and sides. And finally, there's the X-axis, where this will map properly on the side, the face on the right, but not properly on the front face or the bottom face. Now, there's two ways to alleviate this problem, and I'll talk about the second one first. The simplest way is if you just want the same image on all sides of this cube, there's a new type of texture mapping in VT4000 that lets you accomplish this. And this is cubic image mapping. If we go to cubic image map, you'll notice that there's no longer an X, Y, or Z choice here. We don't even have that choice. When we render this out, it's going to render the image properly on X, Y, and Z axes. Now, this works just great if you want the same image on all the sides. Otherwise, what you're going to need to do here is you're going to have to go in and change the texture name, change the surface name for each different side. So let's just go in and do that real quickly in Modeler, just refresh your memory. What we need to do here is, let's say we wanted a different image on the side. Well, we'd go into Modeler, and let's do an import object here. Even though we have this cube, let's make sure we have the right object. So we'll go to an open layer, we'll import the cube, and what we'll do is we will rename the polygons. Now, if this is our face, this is our front, and this is our back polygon, these are our sides here. We're looking from the top now. So these are our sides. Let's just select those. And I'm going to use the right mouse button here and drag a lasso around the side. That selects this side face. Hold down the Shift key and lasso this side. Selects that side face. And now let's select a new image name for these. And what we'll do is, these are right now called cube. What we'll do is we'll name these two cube sides. You could also, if you wanted to, call this cube x-axis. I often will label things as x, y, or z axes so I remember when I'm image mapping. Let's apply this. And now let's export this. And exit back out. Now if we were to just do a quick render here, what you're going to find is the front and the bottom faces are mapped the same way we were when we left. The side faces, though, are back to a default surface. And here's the way this looks rendered. So if we wanted to map another picture onto this, like the picture of marble that comes with the toaster, let's just load that up. Go to Images, Load Image. And instead of the wood drawer, we'll go to the marble directory, load VT Pompeii. Now we'll go to Surfaces, pick the cube side surface, Texture, and I have two choices here. I'll pick VT Pompeii. I could do an x-axis, click on automatic size. This would work, there'd be nothing wrong with it, but I'm lazy. So my choice is, if I'm mapping it onto a cube, I don't even want to think about that. I just always use cubic image mapping. It will still work, because remember, we have different surface names on the side here. So I'll just use surface cubic image mapping, use texture, and this is the way it'll render out now. Okay, let's talk about some of the other buttons that we have here. Let's just take a quick look at those. And the buttons down here, anti-aliasing, pixel blending, and negative image. Let's talk about anti-aliasing and pixel blending first. Anti-aliasing and pixel blending, you'll see, are by default on. The reason why is you'll generally want them on, so the program automatically sets them up that way. Anti-aliasing, if it were turned off, the images would often be more shimmery because of NTSC. You'd get thin lines that would flicker, and they don't look as good. Anti-aliasing on makes the images look much more better, smooths out the rough edges. Now, pixel blending is important if you're going to be flying close to a surface. Because what you're doing here is actually mapping a picture here, if you were to fly up very close, normally you might be able to see the individual pictures or picture elements in that image that's mapped onto an object. By turning pixel blending on, if the camera flies very close to an object that's image mapped, you can't really tell that there's these individual square pixels. It smooths them out. Now, negative image makes basically a photo negative of the image that you're using. And so, for instance, here at the VT Pompeii image, or to click on negative image, it would render out as a negative, and often with this VT Pompeii, it is a better looking image. And this is also a quick way to take one image and use it in a scene and have it look like two different surfaces. Right, now let's quickly talk about the other two types of major image mapping, which are cylindrical or spherical. Now, you'd want to use these depending upon the object you're using, for instance, cylinders or spheres. Planar image mapping works great on objects that are flat edges, for instance, the front of a TV set or the front of a logo. On the other hand, when you're working with a sphere, like wrapping the world map around a sphere, well, then you need to use a different type of mapping. Otherwise, it would basically put the image flat onto the object and it wouldn't work at all. So the first thing we want to talk about is cylindrical image mapping. Let's just clear our scene out here and load up an object that will work with that. And I'm going to the food directory, and I want to load up the PopCan object. And let's just load up an image to wrap around that. And I'm going to hit load image, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up a frame store. You can load frame stores as images as well. To get these, you need to go to a different drawer, though. So let's click on Path, and I will clear out everything past the colon. VT1 colon is the name of my hard drive. So I'll type in VT1 frame store. Your hard drive might be named differently, but this will bring up your frame store directory. And I'll click on VT4000. And this will load the frame store, and again, you can use frame stores just the same way you'd use images. Okay, now that we've got this frame store loaded, let's go to Surfaces, and we will find the can label. Now remember, with planar image mapping, you can think of an imaginary line that runs through the surface. So if we map it on the front face, you can imagine it going through the z-axis. Now, with cylindrical image mapping, you can imagine that when you're wrapping it around the surface, you're wrapping it around the axis. So if your object, your cylinder, loads in this way, when you wrap the image around it, think of it as you're wrapping it around the y-axis. And if you look at the way the pop can loads in, it loads in standing straight up. So we're going to want to map this around the y-axis. Now, if our cylinder came in tilted towards you, in other words, like a tube that was coming towards you, a can of soda leaning forward towards the camera, then you'd want to wrap it around this axis, which again is the z-axis. If it came in tilted on its side, then you'd want to map it around the x-axis. So generally on cylinders like this, you map it around the y, because for cans and that sort of thing, they generally come in standing straight up, but it can change depending upon what kind of object you're working with. In this case, it's pretty straightforward. We go to Surfaces, Can Label, Texture, Cylindrical Image Map, around the y-axis, that's what's set already. We will choose the label here, in this case the Toaster 4000 logo, and let's do an automatic sizing to set our center and size values properly. And let's render this out to see the way the pop can looks with the Toaster 4000 label. Now the image you're seeing here was rendered at medium resolution. You notice we didn't change the resolution. No anti-aliasing, that's why there's still some jaggies. But again, this is the good use for cylindrical image mapping. Finally, let's talk about spherical image mapping. And to do that, we're going to need a sphere. So we will just go quickly back into Modeler here. And let's go to a clean layer and drag out a ball shape. And let's just set it up with numeric. It'll be a little quicker. We want to use a globe. We'll leave sides and segments where they are. Center 0, 0, 0, and then the radii 50, 50, and 50. And we will hit the return key to make this. Here's our sphere. And now let's save this as sphere. Exit out and clear out the scene and just load that up. Okay, so the sphere is now loaded up. Now I'll just load up the same frame store that we had before. Going to load image and just picking the VT4000 logo again. And now we've got the sphere and the logo. Let's find out how we would wrap that image around this. Again, it's very straightforward. In fact, this is the simplest type of mapping, aside from cubic mapping as far as I'm concerned. What you'd want to do is, we will go to our surface here. We will use spherical. Pick the thing that we want to use, and then we'll just leave it on Y. You don't even necessarily have to automatically size here, although you might want to change the center. It never hurts to hit it. The important thing here about spherical mapping is that you generally always use Y, and you don't really have to set a texture size. In fact, you'll notice there's no texture size button. So let's just hit this and see how it renders. Now, if you take a look at the program monitor, you'll be able to see here that this has rendered out around the sphere. You'll also see that we didn't have smoothing on for this sphere, which would have helped a little bit. But again, you do get the idea. It has wrapped the image around the sphere. There's one other type of image mapping we can talk about real briefly. It's a very special use image map. And what that is front projection mapping. And if we go to the textures menu here, you'll see that front projection mapping gives you very, very few actual controls. You have texture center, texture fall off, negative image, and that's it. And the reason is front projection mapping, again, it's not something that comes up a lot in day-to-day use. What it would allow you to do, for instance, is if you had framed grab pictures of me talking now, and then you put an object in front of me, and you were to front projection map the sequence of images, which is me being grabbed, onto that, well, you would be able to see right through it. Now, what do you use that for? Basically, sort of high-end special effects stuff. It's used for creating masks or stencils when you're trying to create when you're trying to create scenes. But again, it's nothing that I've ever used in any regular project, and there are some uses for it, but they're a little beyond the scope of this tape. Okay, now let's talk about bump mapping. Now you understand textures. We talked about procedurals and image maps. Bump mapping can now come into play, and bump mapping is the way we give an object texture. Let's load up that urn object that we had before. And let's start to affect that a little bit. Again, tutorials, urn. And again, let's go to low res here before we render this, and let's just render this out with its default setting. So here's the way the urn looks normally, and you can see that the surface of the urn is very, very smooth. Now, sometimes you don't want that. You want the surface itself to look like it's got some texture, and that's where bump mapping comes into play. And the reason we haven't talked about bump mapping before is because bump mapping is a texture. Bump mapping only works with textures. And you can see bump mapping on the surfaces panel right down here. When we click on bump map, it brings up the different surfaces we have to choose from: planar, cylindrical, spherical, and cubic image mapping, ripples, and fractal bumps. And we're going to start with fractals to put a sort of random pattern onto our bumps here. So what we're going to do is create a random pattern of bumps. And again, the size determines how big those bumps will be. Well, in this case, our urn is 1 foot tall, about 1 foot tall. And I'm going to make it fairly small bumps. So I'll make each one of the bumps about 8 millimeters. So we'll just go to texture size. 0.008 is 8 millimeters. And amplitude determines how bumpy the surface will be. 100% is pretty darn bumpy. 50% is less bumpy. It's pretty much that simple. Now the other thing we have to set here obviously is frequencies. And again, that determines the amount of detail in this pattern. Let's just go with the frequencies of 3, the default, and render this out and see how this affects the surface. Now bump mapping is another very, very good way to give surfaces more of a realistic look. For instance, if you just mapped an image map onto a flat plane, well, it wouldn't look particularly realistic because there's no depth to it whatsoever. Whereas adding bump mapping, like this for instance, you see how it gives the entire object sort of a beaten up look here. Now this is with 100% amplitude. Let's drop our amplitude down a little bit. Let's go to 40%. Again, you can see here as it renders down, we're just less bumpy. Now, obviously, changing the amount of detail, changing the frequencies would increase render time, whereas decreasing the frequencies would speed up render time, but it would also give you less detail in the pattern. Now, this is the way it works with fractals, and it works the same way with ripples or with any of your image maps. So you could take an image and use the image map to determine the bump map pattern. And this can be handy, for instance, when you're trying to do embossed letters. And I can show you a real quick example of that here. Let me just load up the image from the workstations directory. Let me go back to my main control panel here. To do that, I'm going to clear out everything in this requester and hit enter. And this shows me my images directory. I will go to workstation, and where it says VT label, this is a simple 2-color picture, and it says video toaster. What I'm going to do is go to my surface, bump map, pick a cylindrical image map because we want to wrap it around the urn here. Y-axis is fine. Pick VT label and do an automatic size here. And I could see that when I was looking at the image that the video toaster part of this label is down fairly low. So I'm going to raise my texture center a little bit here in the Y-axis. So instead of 0.1486, I'm going to change this to 0.2 and hit OK. That will just raise the whole thing a little bit by adjusting the center. And let's take a look at the way this looks. I will bring the amplitude back up to 100%. And again, as it renders down here, you'll see that it looks like the words are now etched into the side there. You can see that they're raised on the side, and that can be very, very effective. And of course, you could do other things. If you had a pattern that was just a series of little lines, just little straight lines, you could easily create something that looks like nicks or cuts on something. Now, one thing that's important to understand about all these textures is you can combine these effects. So in other words, let's take a look back out here at our surfaces requester. You notice that we've been using textures for surface color and bump mapping so far, but you also have textures for luminosity, diffusion, specularity, reflectivity, and transparency. Now, this is the reason I've been saying value instead of color a lot of the time. The reason I've been saying you pick, for instance, two values instead of two colors is because you're working really with values here. You can apply any of these textures, the procedurals or the image maps, to other attributes such as diffusion, specularity, transparency, and so on. And let's take a good look at an example where we do that, a pretty simple example here. So let's clear out our scene here, and we will load up the sphere object that we used before. And let's load up two images, and these are both world maps. One of them, 4-color world map, has a number of different colors on it. And again, our previews here just show up as black and white. But the other image here, world map black and white, this is the same image. You can see there's less colors here. And you can also see that because the bits per pixel is 1. 1 bit per pixel means it's a 2-color image, whereas world color map is 3 bits per pixel, so there's more colors in that image. There's 8 colors. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the sphere and we're going to wrap the 4-color version around the sphere, use that as a surface map. That'll give us a globe. So we will just go to Surfaces, turn on Smoothing, and under our surface color for texture, use the spherical image map, 4-color, we'll choose that as our image. Y-axis, that's fine. Hit automatic sizing just for fun, and then use texture. And let's just take a quick low-res render of this to see how it looks so far. Okay, and you can see the globe there. Now, one thing you'll notice about this is that the sides of the globe aren't really as round as I would like. And the reason for that is when we created this sphere, we really didn't use as many segments around the side as I normally would use. But this has nothing to do with the surfaces. This is just when we created the model. We'd want a model with really more polygons than we have. But the surface is fine. Now what we want to do is we're going to use the black and white version of this and apply a transparency map. And by applying a transparency map with the same image, but just a black and white version, what we'll have is we'll have a clear glass globe where we will have basically the ocean parts will be invisible. We'll make them glass-like, and just the land masses will show up here. And this is a very, very nice sort of corporate, sort of newsy look. So let's just add that, and we'll go to Surfaces, and we'll go to Transparency, go to Texture, and again we're doing the same thing, a spherical image map, except now we're picking the black and white version, automatic size. And because we're using the black and white version, what's going to happen here is any areas that are dark are going to show up as invisible, and areas that are light are going to show up as visible. If we wanted to switch that, we just use the negative image button here. And this is a pretty good use for negative image, is sort of reversing an effect. On the urn that we did before with the video toaster, if we wanted to put the urn another way, all we'd have to do is just do a negative image. And instead of being indented, it would then be embossed on the surface. So let's just go with this, use texture, and just do a render here. And one thing that you'll notice is if you do a render like this, that it's going to take a lot more time, because again, remember, transparency adds to the time. Also, we're going to have a problem on this, and we'll fix that problem. If you take a look at the program monitor here, you'll see that it's a little bland right here. It did what I said. It's made the oceans transparent. But if we want this to be glass, first off, we need a little bit of shininess. Also, we cannot see basically the land masses on the other side of the globe. Why not? Because we don't have double-sided on here. By putting double-sided on, then we'll see the back faces. Remember, generally when you're using transparency, you want to have double-sided turned on. So let's go back to Surfaces, turn double-sided on, and let's give ourselves a specular value of 100%, and let's go high for the glossiness, and maybe make our surface color a little bit blue, and kind of use color highlights. That means we'll get a nice blue glint on this. And this should make a little bit of difference here. You should be able to see the background more. And again, though, because we've added double-sided, it is going to increase the render time, but it will be a pretty nice looking image here. So, and as this renders down, you can see this is a little more what we're looking for here. This has the sort of glass look that we like. And again, let me just change the background color and render it one more time so you can see it offset a little bit better. I also might change the glossiness. I'm not sure if I like the hotspot the way it is. Yeah, and this is just part of the process as you kind of try things and experiment. I've turned off color highlights and gone to a medium glossiness. And I will just change my background color here to a sort of lighter blue, which will be more interesting than the black, and re-render. And again, this is just the basic process you go through. You try things, you render, you see what you want it to look like. If it's not quite there, just change your settings. And let's take a look at the final version here. Okay, as this renders down, you can see we can really sort of see the back of the whole image. We can see it a little bit better now. And again, this is just low res, so it's a little jaggy around the sides. But you do get the idea, and you can see that we can use any of these textures with something like transparency or specular, diffuse, any of those settings, create very, very nice looking effects. Okay, let's finish up and do a quick logo and use the reflection map image again. And let's talk about how we do that. Now, we'll escape back here. And one thing that's important to note is if you want to use images that will load up properly here, the best way to do that is to use Toaster Paint and save your images using the Save RGB option from Toaster Paint. Now, we don't have enough time in this tape to get into Toaster Paint, so if you're not familiar with it, check your manual or the tape on Toaster Paint in the series. But the idea is if you want an image that you can load up easily from the Images Requester, go into Toaster Paint, load that frame store, or just load it in using the grab feature of Toaster Paint, then save that as an RGB image. Now, given that, one thing I will let you know that makes a very, very good image for reflection mapping is just a crinkly piece of tinfoil. It works very well. For you want to try your own reflection map, it's a good place to start. I'm just going to use the fractal reflections image that comes with the toaster, because that's very, very nice too. And let's go in and start by going into Model and just creating our logo. And we get a lot of things going on here, so I'm going to clear out the whole project by just doing a new. That will get rid of everything. And let's just start by creating our text object. Okay, and we'll just type in our text. And I'm using Harvest Italic as the font here. Let's hit OK. And this looks okay so far. I'm going to use the F1 key, which is the keyboard shortcut for the macro that centers, so I can see it a little bit better. Let's go to Multiply. We'll do an Extrude. And we will set a good distance. I don't want this to be too thick. It's about right. Return key to give it the distance. And let's start by just selecting the front polygons. I'm using the right mouse button with the polygon button down here chosen and dragging a lasso around the front faces. Now I am going to bevel the front faces. And to use the bevel tool, we just click on the bevel button. 10 centimeters would be way too much. I'll go to about 2 centimeters as our inset here. Sometimes you may need to do this a few times to make sure it's right, but in this case we got it on the first try. Okay, let's just zoom in a bit. And what we're going to want is, I'm going to want to pick the front faces here, the very front face. And I'm just going to make this window bigger. And I'm again using the lasso. And I'm just surrounding the front face. None of the bevel got in here, just the fronts. Now I'm going to hold down the Shift key. And again, drag the lasso through here. Now the backs are chosen. And let's create a surface name for the fronts and backs. And we'll call this Lightwave Fronts. That's okay. And now what we'll do is, let's select the side faces here. And I think that should be about all the side faces. I'm just continuing to drag over here to make sure we're not missing any. Couple more in there. That looks like it's about it, okay? Now I'm going to hit Q again. It brings up surfaces. We'll call this Lightwave Sides. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Statistics menu. And just hit A to fit this in. And I'm going to select just everything that's still called default here. And that should be just the bevels, and it is. I can see that none of these faces are chosen. So now I'm going to name these bevels, and I will name these Lightwave Bevels. Alright, so now what we've done is we have 3 different surface names. The fronts and back are Lightwave Fronts, the sides are Sides, the bevel is Bevel. And the reason we can do that, the reason we want to do that is so we can set different surfaces for those different attributes. And the reason you do that is because a lot of times on logos you'll see the sides have one surface, a matte blue for instance, whereas the fronts might be another surface and the bevels would be a third. So So let's just leave this where it is, save the object, and save it as Lightwave, exit out, and let's load that object up. All right, here we go. Now we're also going to load up an image here, and we will load up the fractal reflections image. And let's just set our surface attributes here, and we'll start by setting it for just the sides. Now what we want to do here is create a reflective metal look. So the idea here would be to set our diffuse and specular down to 0, set our reflection up to 100%. So diffuse down to 0, specular is already there. Reflection, 100%. And now we want to select that fractal reflections image to use as a reflection map. And then we could also set our surface color here, let's say to a sort of goldish color, and then turn on color highlights. And by turning on color highlights, what's going to happen is our reflective surface will take on the surface color we've chosen. Now there's a quick way to do just what we did here, and that's by loading up one of the surfaces that already comes with the toaster, for instance the gold surface. If we load up the gold surface here, you'll notice that it's basically the same as what we chose here. No diffuse, no specular, 100% reflective of fractal reflections, a color chosen here, and color highlights. There's also the brass and there's actually copper and silver that work real well too. Now you notice that smoothing is on. We want smoothing on for the sides, so I'm fine with that. Let's go to our surface for the bevels. Let's load the surface called silver for that. And on the fronts, let's reload the gold surface. Okay. Now, let's go and just take a quick render of this. And we'll move this towards the camera. Keyframe it in position. Bring our camera to low res. And just hit F9 to do a quick render here. And you're going to see the problem immediately on the front faces. And this is a problem that's pretty easy to avoid, but I see it a lot on logos. And this is something that happens kind of bad with reflection mapping. If you'll notice, if we take a look at our object here, you notice the way the front faces look. They don't look good. And the problem is that smoothing is on, whereas those faces are flat. And we can make these look a lot better just by going in and turning off smoothing for any faces, like the front and back faces, that should be just not smooth. Those are flat faces. There's no reason to have smoothing on there. We're not trying to smooth out a curve at all. So we will go to Surfaces, pick Fronts, turn Smoothing off, and just watch the difference here as it renders down. It's going to look 1,000 times better. And this is a little rendering problem that you can get into if you have a flat face with smoothing turned on. So be careful of that when you're using reflective metals. And here's the way it looks now. Those front faces look much better. And the side faces look just so-so here. One of the problems is that we're just in low res. And let's just show you how this would look at medium resolution. And this is how it looks rendered out at medium res. And let's just take a look at a quick animation that shows this going by. And you can see how the metal surface reacts with the light. This is the reason the metal reflective surface works well. And this is the reason you'd want to use reflection mapping. It's because it looks very, very effective when it's animated. Okay, that's all the time we have for this tape. We hope you will just take the time to learn the things we've talked about here and really get in and start to experiment. Surfaces are one of the areas that you can exert the most creative control and really start to make a project look like your own. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to write to us at the address you see on your screen right now. Until next time, I'm Lee Stranahan. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.